Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice. What is up with Congress? Congress's failure to function in basic ways is actually one of the biggest stories in American politics. Its retreat from relevance has created a vacuum filled by executive abuse, we know all about that, and Supreme Court overreach. It can be hard to imagine, but the framers of the Constitution actually designed the government so that Congress, which was the most democratic branch, would be the most powerful. But in recent years, we all know Congress has been defined by dysfunction, by stagnation, and struggles for power. And recently, the public has noticed it has been marked by historically low levels of activity. In 2025, the House of Representatives held the second lowest amount of votes in the past quarter century. There have been government shutdowns and a general lack of action. We're in the middle of a government shutdown partially even today, even though we don't necessarily even remember it all the time. And very relevant, of course, it has ceded powers that are really supposed to be for the legislative branch to the executive, including the power over war and the power over the federal purse. How can we make Congress work better? How can we get it unstuck? How can we make sure it stands up to the president, but also stands up for the things voters sent members of Congress to do? To talk about that, there's an exciting and I think really good new book by a colleague of mine at the Brennan Center, Maya Kornberg. She's a political scientist, senior research fellow here at the Brennan Center, and her new book is called Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. It's both history, it draws from dozens of firsthand accounts and robust research talking to members of Congress, and it's an agenda for action about what Congress can do to make real progress and what are the things that are stopping progress right now. It's a great pleasure to work with her and to talk with her. And Maya, thank you so much for being here with us. Your book looks very directly at the disillusionment that Americans have right now with Congress. But there's so much going on in our government, so much that's gone wrong. Why did you focus on this particular branch and why on this particular way of looking at it?
So the title of the book, Stuck, speaks to, I think, what a lot of us are feeling right now about American democracy, that it is stuck, that it is not delivering for ordinary Americans in the way that it was designed to do. And so it speaks to how we got here and how we can move forward. It's an attempt to look backward in order to chart a course forward.
It's got history as well as actually a call to action right now.
Yeah, exactly. It's a 50-year retrospective kind of survey looking at Congress starting with the Watergate babies of 1974 and documenting these distortions of money and media and violence and how they've made change harder. And it looks at how we can unstick Congress with concrete policy recommendations for getting Congress back on track.
So your point and the title and the cover are great. Your point is that there have been other times when Congress has been stuck, when it hasn't done what it's supposed to do. It's receded in power or in activity. But one of the ways it gets unstuck is these wave elections where lots of new members of Congress come in. Yep. And your point in part is that we can learn from that, but also that there are things now that might make it even harder for actual change to happen.
Right, exactly. It's both. It is both that there are wave elections, and the book looks at 3 wave elections. These are the 3 moments, the class of 1974, the class of 1994, and the class of 2018, when the largest groups of new members came to Congress over the past half century. I chose to focus on these moments because these are inflection points for Congress, because Congress is perhaps the most changeable when there are waves of change and new members coming in to shake things up and breathe new energy into it.
When voters get a say, and they often will elect people who don't have the traditional backgrounds that the other members of Congress had
and what was unique about these classes, all 3 of them, is that all 3 of them, you saw huge numbers of new members who did not look like who was in Congress already, who were younger than the average member of Congress, who were less experienced in terms of legislative experience, and in the class of 2018, who brought a richness of lived experience that was different in terms of race and gender and age and other things. So these are people who are coming to shake up and change the institution, both in a descriptive sense and in terms of policy change. And I think that's why these are three really important moments to learn from.
Some of this, I bet, to people hearing about this who don't think about this all that much, it almost sounds like fan fiction. Wait a minute, you mean there was a time when voters spoke up and a bunch of new sort of Mr. Smith goes to Washington types showed up in Washington, but it happens more often than you would think.
It happens, and it's not just nostalgia. I'm a believer that we can look to history and that it rhymes, and that power, whether it be power between Congress and the executive or other kind of ways in which power is allocated in the United States and in government, it ebbs and flows in ways that repeat themselves. And so we could look directly to the class of 74 and the frustration with executive overreach, with foreign wars, with other things, and see that's happening now.
Let's talk about that. And people who work with us here at the Brennan Center and people even who might listen to this podcast know it doesn't take much to get me going on Watergate. And they sort of one of our colleagues pulls me aside and says, "Do not talk about Watergate." But in fact, that when you refer to 1974, what happened that year and what actually swept into Congress?
Yeah, well, we're not a good match of folks to not be talking about Watergate, I think. Because I was
old enough to actually. I was not actually a participant in the Watergate scandal, but I was aware of it while it was actually happening. And the book starts there for a reason. The book starts there with the Watergate babies, as they're known. The backdrop is 1974, the increasingly costly and unpopular war in Vietnam, the Nixon resignation, and the scandal that was Watergate. And you have this wave of new young members who are saying, we're going to clean up Washington. We're going to fix the system. And they come in the 1970s, Congress does things that I think are very relevant to look at today. They passed the Impoundment Control Act after President Nixon impounds tens of billions of dollars. Refuses to spend the money that Congress
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, known as impoundment, which we're seeing again today with President Trump. They passed the War Powers Resolution to try to take back some of the war powers that the president is usurping. So there's a lot of things happening where Congress is trying to strengthen itself as a branch, trying to fight back against this overreach.
This came after the Cold War, after Vietnam, after Nixon doing everything he did, and after this period where Congress chose to take a backseat to the executive in those days, and there was quite a bit of corruption and controversy and a collapse of public trust even then. I'll note in 1974, it wasn't only Watergate, it wasn't only the institutional stuff, but also an energy crisis, an economic crisis due to a war in the Middle East. So a lot of times these structural and reform issues come up when there's something else going on that people think is not getting addressed.
100%. And I think that's where we can draw the comparison now. We're sitting here several months before yet another midterm election. And what we know is that when Congress changes, when there is a wave election, that's when there is widespread public frustration with something that isn't working. And so this energy to come fix government, my book tracks 3 major times in the last half century where that happens. But that's not unique. That is, again, as I said, that is the ebb and flow in our government of how things work. And so you can look backward, again, to figure out how we can do that again.
So that in 1974, this gigantic new class comes in. As you said, a lot of them, they'd been anti-war protesters. Mm-hmm. Toby Moffett was the leading consumer advocate in Connecticut. He got elected to the House. There were a lot of people with unorthodox backgrounds who did not just come out of, the political party machines. Mm-hmm. What were they able to do? As you said, we talk a lot about this post-Watergate set of changes, reforms, guardrails that were erected. It wasn't only that they were part of passing those things as statutes to constrain the president. They actually changed a little bit how Congress worked.
I would argue more than a little bit.
Yeah, how did that work and what didn't happen?
Yeah. So first of all, to set the scene, these are changes like other changes that had already been brewing for a while. And when this class comes in, Bella Abzug is known to have said in a hearing, and again, she was a congresswoman who was already in Congress at the time, she says, reinforcements have arrived.
She was a very flamboyant, very loud member of Congress who was portrayed on the television series Mrs. America as far more low-key than she was in real life.
Yeah, so she's there. She and other senior members have issues with how the system is working. And so these new members come in, they comprise a huge proportion then of the Democratic caucus. And they're able to change things like the way that committee assignments and committee chairmanship decisions are made.
So the system that had been dominant of seniority guiding who could control the committees, the committees having all this power, the chairs of the committees being really the dominant force in Congress. This wave of new members worked with the leadership, right, to try to undo that. And that was one of the things, these internal issues can sound kind of arcane, but it actually has a lot to do with whether Congress can stand up on its own 2 feet.
100%. I mean, so Henry Waxman, who's another member of that class, who folks may know because he was in Congress for 4 decades, he called this toppling old lions. They had these, senior, deeply entrenched committee chairs, and because of these new processes, they were able to, quote, topple old lions, and new members were able to gain access to leadership positions, which was, quite unusual relative to what freshmen are normally able to do in Congress. And that kind of restructuring allowed for these new voices that people elected to have power to actually pass their agenda. If you're electing people to Congress, but they, don't actually have power to drive forward legislation because they don't have access to key positions, then there's only so much that they can get done. But I think what's unique about the 74 class is that they were able to rise to positions where, to give the example of Henry Waxman, he was able to rise to chair a subcommittee relevant to health and then drive forward key healthcare legislation. And that was why he came to Congress. So, there were so many examples of that. And I think that that's why it is essential. Voters elected them and they changed the system in a way that gave them more power, amplified their power to actually be able to act on behalf of
This is the part that sounds like fan fiction because you could actually get elected, get a subcommittee berth pretty quickly, and actually use that to actually make policy for your constituents or for things you cared about. Now let's fast forward to the next wave election you described, which was in 1994. Very somewhat similar atmospherics perhaps, but very different in the impact on Congress. What was that election?
Right. So fast forward 1994, after 40 years of Democratic control of the House.
Uninterrupted,
Republicans regained control of the House. Again, you have nearly 90 new members sweeping in. They're running change campaigns, again, about how to fix government. They have what's called the Contract with America. This is a change agenda document.
They literally, Newt Gingrich was the Republican leader.
Exactly.
They stood on the steps of the House of Representatives as candidates and held up this policy paper and said, if you elect us, we will do this thing. Yeah,
exactly. And that document talks about everything from, things that, to your point, seem mundane to folks like term limiting committee chairs to kind of broader Republican policy priorities like balancing the budget. And so they come in, they have this change document. And again, Congress changes dramatically because of all of these new members. We see Newt Gingrich as a speaker double the power of the party speaker in the party steering committee and further kind of centralize power in the leadership. So now he gets to, have a much bigger say in these committee assignments and committee chairmanship positions and other things.
And legislation starts to get written out of the offices of the Speaker of the House, not out of these committees.
Right,
And is that good or bad?
So, I wrote a whole book, my first book on committees. So, you can guess from that I'm a believer in the committee system. And I believe that strong committees make a strong legislature for a number of reasons. You need committees because they are the way that legislatures apportion responsibility for handling certain issues, and they are sources of specialized expertise with expert staff. I believe that, as the legislative concourse to bill passage, they allow for kind of deliberation and everything that we think of when we think of the kind of Schoolhouse Rock version of how a bill becomes a law. And so when we get to the 90s and we see what we now think is commonplace, which is committees being bypassed and bills being written by a small number of party leaders, that is something that that I would argue is not healthy for the system itself.
Well, and it used to be that the legislation might be heavily influenced or even written by lobbyists in the committees, but now it was getting written in the back room of the leadership, and nobody could even see what was going on. And this so people get a sense of your methodology here.
Yeah.
You didn't just read news clippings. You interviewed because people are alive from all these previous eras.
An unusual number of the members of the class of 74 are alive and happy to talk because they were so young when they were elected. They were several decades younger than the average member of Congress then. And so I interviewed members from that class, from the class of 94, from the class of 2018, which is the last class that I survey in the book, along with activists and advocates and staff, current and former staff, because I wanted to tell a story that was told in their words. I think that is the best way to get a sense of what's going on.
Did you interview Newt Gingrich, or did he not return your call?
I tried to get in touch with Newt Gingrich. He did not return my call. But if he wants to be interviewed by me, I'd still love to talk to him. I think that I've written about him now in 2 books, and he's responsible for a lot of major changes in Congress that I'd love to chat with him about.
The paperback awaits.
Exactly.
And then there was the third wave, which in a lot of ways because the Gingrich revolution, he overinterpreted his mandate like presidents often do. Mm-hmm. Time magazine had him on the cover calling it a revolution. He really thought of himself as a prime minister in effect. And
he was an iron-handed ruler. I mean, when you talk to people who were in that class, a lot of them were frustrated that they didn't have a say. It was a very top-down set of changes.
They were the votes for him, but they didn't actually. It wasn't as much of a kind of
a bottom-up
a bottom-up thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But that Congress, that regime sort of tore itself up in budget fights with Bill Clinton, who I worked for, in their failed impeachment,
in the
shutdowns, in the resignation first of Gingrich, then his successor, and there was a lot of turmoil that was introduced. But then the third group, and then we'll talk about now, not the fan fiction phase, but the dystopian fiction phase. The third year you look at, which people might not remember as much, even though it's more recent, is 2018.
Right.
Why did you include that election as like the others?
So this is another huge wave of freshmen that come to Congress. I looked at 3 of the largest groups of freshmen who came to Congress over the past 50 years.
And it's not so typical that you get like 2 or 3 seats changing hands. Like when there's...
I'm talking about 90 new members coming.
Right.
I mean, this is something that is a huge proportion of the institution turning over. And there's another thing that's that all 3 classes have in common, and that is that they're all tied to impeachment proceedings in different ways. They all represent inflection points in Congress's relationship with the executive and moments of this widespread frustration. So for all 3 of those reasons, they were huge classes. There was widespread frustration that swept them in, and they represent these inflection points with the executive.
Where they stand up and say the president has too much power. We're not going to let the president swan around like they're the king or whatever. And so you had Richard Nixon, of course, facing impeachment. Bill Clinton was impeached, and Donald Trump was impeached twice by the people who were elected in 2018. And you've made the point that there was something noteworthy about them, too, in how they got elected and the issues they were talking about when they ran.
Yes. So the class of 2018, and again, I think that this is a theme throughout the book, this is another change campaign. Over 100 candidates in that class, they sign a letter to Congress as candidates, and they say, we want the first bill that Congress takes up in the new term to be a democratic reform bill, to be a bill that talks about fixing some of these things that we're running to change, campaign finance and voting rights and other things.
This is what became H.R. 1.
Yeah, we see that become H.R. 1, and not only does it become H.R. 1, but members of this class are given ownership over key parts of this bill, which is quite unusual for a freshman class. And again, this bill becomes a major piece of legislation in the House. It does not become law, but it is a major piece of legislation in the House, and I think speaks to some of the hopes and dreams of the reformers who come there in 2018.
I can tell you during that, because of course this is something we at the Brennan Center were quite involved with. In the run-up to that election, I remember talking to a senior member of the House Democratic leadership, not Speaker Pelosi, but another person, who said, oh, we're not going to do all this reform stuff if we get in.
Right.
And it was quite clear that it was the clamor from the new members who had pledged all this to their voters that shifted this person and others into prioritizing it.
That speaks to the power of wave elections. They had collective power. And many of them, when I interviewed them, told me, and this won't surprise folks, that when they were elected, Nancy Pelosi called them and asked for their votes for her as Speaker. And so, that was one bargaining tool amongst others that they had. She needed their votes for Speaker, and they, like the class of 74 and like other wave election years, they are now a huge proportion of the Democratic caucus. And so smart leaders like Pelosi understood that they would have to work with the freshmen and bring them in and give them positions
not just
of power.
Be threatened by them, but
exactly.
See them as the kind of what could be their shock troops.
Exactly.
In doing what they want to do. So now we get up to now, and the subtitle of your book is how money and media and violence affect Congress. And you have observed, and the book really talks about how we're in the run-up to an election now. Maybe it will be another wave election. Even if it's not, it's actually much harder to make change in Congress, and thus for Congress to actually step up and perform its appropriate role in the system for reasons that are beyond any individual member, right? Why did you pick those three things?
Right. So in the 50 years that the book examines, we see the landscape of American politics changing dramatically. In 1976, Buckley v. Valeo, the Supreme Court decision which rules that spending limits are unconstitutional, unleashes a flood of money into campaigns. We see this amplified with the 2010 Citizens United decision. And many people, I think, who are listening might think about this in the context of campaigns, and rightfully so. It's, you have to raise more money to run now. But I think equally important, and sometimes not as much appreciated, is the way that it's distorting lawmaking itself. So over these 50 years, we've now gotten to a point where you have to pay your way to get onto a committee. You have to pay dues to the party.
Explain that, because it's sort of mind-blowing to most people.
Right. So members are expected to pay dues to the party, sometimes millions of dollars. And I quote members in the book saying, I don't know how I'm going to leverage the community that I represent to pay my dues. Think about how crazy that is. This is not a member saying, I don't know how I'm going to raise the money I need to win my reelection. This is how I'm going to pay dues to the party.
I don't represent Beverly Hills. I don't represent Manhattan. How am I going to give enough money to get the committee slot that I want?
Exactly. And speaking of Beverly Hills, you have now what's called leadership PACs. Henry Waxman, who represented Beverly Hills for 40 years, he starts a leadership PAC after Buckley v. Valeo. That's a kind of vehicle for him to be able to donate money to other members in order to build clout, in order to campaign for a committee leadership.
And now that's the norm.
Now almost every member of the House has a leadership PAC. And, again, they use it to donate money to other members, to build clout and power in the chamber. And this is the reality we're in.
How much time do they spend fundraising?
Well, one member told me he spends every mealtime dialing for dollars. Think about how miserable that must be. I quote other members in the book saying this is a major reason that they're retiring. If you can't eat breakfast without dialing for dollars, that sounds like a pretty miserable existence to me. And according to one recent study by the Congressional Management Foundation, members today are only spending a third of their time legislating, which I think is quite mind-boggling. Fundraising is taking an increasing chunk of their time.
And they, as you know, the committee offices for the Congressional campaign committees are off of Capitol Hill, so they can say, well, at least I'm not doing it in my public desk.
Right.
And so you go to these places, and it's like the play or movie Glengarry Glen Ross. It's a bunch of people on the phone calling strangers and asking for money. And you can't believe that this is actually how Congress
and I recently
works.
spoke to someone who worked as a scheduler who said when the congressman that he worked for is invited to speak to constituents, he has to think about, is that worth the call time that I'll be missing? I mean, think about what that means for our democracy. And so, again, we're in a Congress right now where members are spending a lot of their time dialing for dollars. They are under kind of relentless pressure to fundraise, not just to get elected, but to build power in the chamber. And they they don't have as much time left to legislate. So that is kind of one of the through lines that my book chronicles, and it looks at how this changes from the 1970s to today. And then happy to talk about the violence in media.
I was going to say,
which are pretty central as well.
Violence in media. What did you mean by those? And how do they affect the atmosphere up
So,
there?
of course, American political violence is not new. It has a very long history in this country. But we're seeing it manifest in different ways now, with social media becoming a major vector for abuse, with changes to gun ownership and gun legislation and other things. And so, again, the book looks at not the incidence of violence, but more importantly, the way that it distorts lawmaking itself. So as with money, it's distorting the process. And the book has examples of how this is changing the way that members think about their political careers, dissuading them from remaining in office, how it is constricting their civic engagement. One member told me there's parts of her own district that she doesn't go to because she doesn't feel safe. Again, this is not a reality that strengthens our democracy. And in many instances, members are saying, I feel scared to vote my conscience because I'm afraid for my physical safety or for the safety of my family.
And you yourself ran for local office and got a sense of what the environment is like, the information environment.
Yes.
Is it similar to what you heard from these members of Congress?
I think in many ways, as a former candidate myself, again, on a local level, but, in this kind of larger structure of American politics, I saw firsthand, first of all, how social media distorts things, how it's become a vector for abusive language and harassment, which I unfortunately also faced as a candidate. I saw how it, tends towards what's most salacious, and that sometimes I think misses a lot of the nuance of the conversation. And I was lucky enough, actually, to be running in a city with small donor public financing. New York City, if you raise small donations, they are matched in the city eightfold by public funds. So I didn't have to dial for dollars all day. I could focus on constituent engagement. That's why I argue in the book we need something like public financing on a national level. But this is kind of directly to the heart of what I think, again, to your point, are larger distortions. They face candidates running for local offices as well.
So if we want Congress to stand up, if we want change in Congress, they're going to have to be changes. They're going to have to be reforms. What is it you would say to new members of Congress if they do get elected? What do you think needs to happen?
First of all, I think that we need to resource and retool Congress if we want it to be able to stand up to the executive. What Newt Gingrich did in the 90s and the Republicans, in that class, and then again, this has just been exacerbated since, is to gut committee structures, to cut their staff. He defunded an entire congressional support agency called the Office of Technology Assessment.
The science agency.
The science agency, which you would argue.
When would science come up in policy making ever since?
Exactly. I could imagine that would be helpful for Congress now. So, those are just several examples of a larger theme, which is that Congress needs to resource itself and reorganize itself in order to take on executive overreach and in order to be responsive to a, modern American political and economic ecosystem. Congress also needs, desperately to pass campaign finance reform, to think about how it can support members to do their jobs. And that includes, security in the current context of physical violence. It also includes things that we would think are basic in a new job, like institutionalized onboarding. They don't have. All these things that I heard from members would be helpful to them. And again, I asked members that I spoke to, I asked every one of them, what would have been helpful for you to have? Many of them were like, I just got there and I didn't have support to learn how to do the job. That's what we need to institute.
Even that is in office with people working together.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think it's shocking to people to understand that Congress just doesn't have some of these basic things that so many other organizations have.
Finally, in each of these instances, the voters at some level set the wheels in motion for the new members of Congress to make change in Congress. What should voters now, given how angry and unhappy people continue to be with how government is functioning, but how Congress is functioning too. They may not love in the opinion polls President Trump, but they don't love Congress more than that.
Certainly. Congress is very unpopular.
So what should, if a voter is there and someone running for office comes up to them, what would you tell voters, what do you think voters ought to be saying right now? How can we take this into our hands?
Yeah. So, I would say three things. First of all, we know from polling that the vast majority of Americans oppose political violence. They support campaign finance reform. So we need to be showing up and speaking up about these things. That's how you change political culture. We need to be showing up at town halls and at field hearings and other things and making our voices heard. Secondly, I saw, as you mentioned, I recently ran for office and had a lot of conversations with voters on a local level. And what I saw was a lot of disillusionment with the system. And I think the scariest part of that is that people might disengage, especially from an unpopular institution like Congress. That they might say, well, then, it's just broken. Let's, bemoan the ineptitude instead of figuring out how to fix it. If there's a takeaway from my book, it's that, Congress is stuck, but it is all the more important to unstick it right now, given the abuse of executive power, given the extent to which we need Congress to show up for the American people. Congress needs the support of voters to engage with it, to fight for it to do better, and to make sure that it is continuing to be the people's branch. It is not a situation where we can afford to disengage from Congress, because that, I think, is a slippery slope.
So, thank you, Dr. Maya Kornberg, for writing this book, for all you do with all of us here at the Brennan Center. Thank you for your expertise being applied to this topic, and thank you for your fighting spirit. I think I think that there is a far greater reservoir of energy and positive desire for actually having things happen that is not that far beneath the surface of cynicism and understandable disgust with how things are going. I think a book like this can help be part of making that happen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Well, I could keep talking with Maya Kornberg all day, because I think this is really interesting stuff. It's really important stuff. And I do think there's a great deal to learn from what's happened before, so we can know what we can actually do now. And one of the lessons, I think, of this book is that, as implausible as it may seem, Congress actually can get unstuck. Voters have the main part in making that happen. I think there's a few things that I drew from Maya's book and also from the work we've done over the years, and I'll just mention them quickly. When it comes to reform, whether it's reform in Congress or reform by Congress of our institutions, timing matters. It's extraordinarily important that people who want change demand that the change happen at the very beginning. At the beginning of a congressional term, when new members of Congress come in, as Maya said, that's when the speaker candidates are asking for their votes. When it comes to campaign finance reform, when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to all these other things, the forces of the status quo will always regroup. They're demoralized at the beginning. They're scattered. That's when you need to actually push for change. And in the times when it really helped, when it really mattered, especially after the Watergate election of 1974, the speed mattered a lot. The second thing I would say is that we have to understand the ways in which Congress is very different now than it has ever been. It used to be actually much easier to get in to see your member of Congress, to interact with your member of Congress, to put pressure on a member of Congress. You didn't just have to have a lobbyist or a PAC. Obviously, they predominated in a lot of ways. People like me screamed about it nonstop. But even so, there was a permeability, the ability to walk into Congress, to walk in and watch the debates from the gallery, to go to your member of Congress's office. It's just much harder. The reasons are the things Maya talked about, especially money, the fact that members of Congress have to do a calculus with every conversation of whether this is going to help them to get the money they need to run, but also to rise up in Congress, and security. And it didn't just start recently, but over and over again, Congress has ratcheted up its security. We all know about January 6th. We know there were shootings in Congress. There have been shootings of people in office around the country. But the end result is it is actually more closed off than it used to be. So what do we do about that? Well, some of the things that Maya talks about in her book include things like new ways to communicate with members of Congress through digital means, other things that could get members of Congress closer to their constituents. One of the things we didn't have a chance to talk about, but we talked about in the conversation with Yuval Levin, the conservative political theorist, is that we actually ought to expand the size of the House of Representatives. What? More of them? That actually would make a big difference. George Washington only spoke on the record 2 times during the Constitutional Convention, which he chaired. But the second one was on the last day of the Constitutional Convention, and he said, I want to make sure that the district sizes of members of Congress are not too big. They actually brought it down to 30,000 people. He had this very basic sense that you need to somehow be connected to your constituents. Now, offices of members of Congress represent 800,000 people at a time. You can't get to know your constituents that way. So there are other ways we should be thinking about that actually just in the most basic, almost civics way, pull members of Congress closer to their constituents. A third and final point. A lot of the problems with Congress are not just problems inside Congress, and they're not just institutional problems where Congress is not standing up to the president, where Congress is not acting when the Supreme Court does something truly egregious, like the Shelby County decision, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. And then they purred disingenuously, oh, it's okay, Congress could fix this, knowing just how hard it is for Congress to do anything of that nature. We have some very fundamental mismatches right now between our constitutional system and the political system we've all chosen to have. It was quite clear for a long time that we had, on the one hand, a Madisonian political system designed by James Madison with lots of checks and balances and veto points at every level because we wanted to avoid tyranny. All these veto points, all these checks and balances on the one hand. And on the other hand, we now have, for the first time in the country's history, a divided political party system where one party is on the right and the other is on the left. The most liberal Republican is to the right of the most conservative Democrat. And people saw this developing. This is because of how media works, but it's also what people feel, where people live, social trends, and that sort of thing. We've said, well, how do you combine a Madisonian system with a kind of Western European, Westminster-style party system? How's that going to work? Well, it turns out it doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. And this is in many ways the hardest nut to crack of all, because if the two political parties are going to only wind up viewing themselves as cheerleaders for the leader of their party or a booing section, in this case it's President Trump being cheered or booed by the members of Congress, then we're not going to be able to make this political system work very well. It's not a parliamentary system. It's this somewhat unique in the world sort of checks and balances going back to the 1700s. And one of the things that we have to keep pushing and pushing Congress to do, the members of Congress, is not only to think of themselves as partisans, not only to think of themselves as ideologues, as, say, the Watergate babies did or the Gingrich class did, but as members of an institution. Madison said that checks and balances would work because everybody would be jealous of their own power. He said ambition would check ambition. Believe it or not, we need to figure out how we, as the voters, as the public, can push them to be a little more ambitious, a little more jealous in guarding their power. These are big issues. You might think it's abstract stuff. Maya Kornberg's book brings it to life. And we are living through our own history right now with a war, with an economic challenge, with gas prices once again going through the roof, and with voters angry and wanting something else to happen. Someday someone will be writing about this moment. Let's make sure we all do our part to bring about change. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, as ever, please subscribe on the various platforms where people do that sort of thing, and give us good ratings. And above all, please share with your friends. That's the best way to get the word out. Thanks very much.